All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is the only software your business will ever need. Featuring a suite of integrated business applications, Odoo connects your business operations together so you can get more done in less time. Odoo has apps for everything: CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, marketing, manufacturing, you name it, Odoo's got it. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, August 29th, 1984. We're stretching it a little bit. It was actually August 27th, 1984. But anyway, on this day, President Ronald Reagan announced the official formation of the Teacher in Space project. As I'm sure you know, listeners, we here are fans of very straightforward titles. You are listening to a podcast called This Day in Esoteric Political History. So this program that was called Teacher in Space Program, well, that's what it was. It was a new initiative to send a teacher into space, the first private citizen sent into space on a NASA shuttle. Now, this day in 1984 was when this program began. The end of this story, essentially and tragically, is a couple years later, January 1986, when the Challenger shuttle exploded a minute and a half after takeoff, killing everyone on board, including a teacher who was part of this program, Christa McAuliffe. So, here to discuss Reagan's initiative, the larger question of private citizens in space, and of course, the tragedy of Christa McAuliffe and the Challenger explosion are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So, Kellie, before we get into the Teacher in Space program, I wonder if you can sort of set us in the early 80s and just like generationally, you know, we have a generation that grew up in the 60s obsessed with space. Yeah. What is the state of America's space obsession at this moment, and how does this teacher program fit into that?
Well, I think when it comes to space, you really have to keep the dream alive. You have to keep the buzz alive, and that has to confer from generation to generation. And so one of the ways they did this was by, including teachers as part of the space program. And if you think about, a teacher being, let's say, 25, that means you were 10 years old, likely, when you saw the space shuttle take off to the moon in 1969. And so You have a whole generation of people who had this transformative, pivotal moment in their life when they watched, this rocket launch into outer space, or the first people that walked on the moon. These are really powerful moments. And so now that these children are adults and they have an opportunity to sort of live out their wildest dreams, an opportunity to go to space, you can imagine there was a lot of buzz and a lot of people who wanted to be on board with this, and also saw themselves as ordinary people attempting to do something extraordinary.
But of course, teachers also are the ones who are then there to inspire the next generation. Yes. So it's like with every teacher you send to space, you in theory have a bunch of kids who are now getting excited about space too. So It's very, you get to skip through the generations.
Yeah.
And it was very much about moving the space program forward, right? We'd had these huge landmark moments with the first orbit and the first moon landing, and there just hadn't been the next big milestone. And that was really frustrating for people at NASA and people who had imagined sort of the original concept of the space program, which was that you were going to have that initial flight and then it was going to develop to become more like the airline industry, right? Yeah. Ordinary people were going to be able to go into space. That had always been the dream, and how folks as early as the 1950s and 1960s had imagined space flight progressing, and yet it hadn't progressed at all, right? It was all these like highly trained astronauts. And so the idea of a civilian going into space, that was a big step forward.
All right. And obviously, like, what you're saying resonates so much now when we have this big conversation about sending people into space. But it's also a reminder that, like, every generation of, let's call them middle-aged men, has had this mantle of, like, whatever happened to America being in love with space? Why don't we send people to the moon anymore? You know, it's like since 1985 and Ronald Reagan, people have been sort of bemoaning in that way. But let's talk about this teacher in space program in particular, because what we've been describing is about excitement in the space race and sending a private citizen into space. But, you know, the initiative, and Reagan himself is also trying to pick up this mantle of, like, honoring and celebrating teachers too. So kind of what are the contours there as you see it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a real big push to get not just, I think, teachers who can inspire their students, but also to work a little in favor with Reagan's reelection. I think he wants to generate a sense of momentum and expectation about what people can think about his next administration might do. So, I mean, I really think in some ways it's a campaign. It's a huge campaign when you think about the stakes that are involved, but it's also one that most people can support and get excited about. And so, you know, having this huge application process, you've got over 11,000 people applying to be in the space program. They're narrowing it down to about 114 finalists. About 2 teachers from every state are going to be represented. So this is like, I mean, when I think about, like, you know how they have like major singing competitions that like you whittle Space down Idol. To the top 10 or whatever.
It's like Miss America.
Yes, like Miss America, American Idol, you know, like, but this is like the space race for teachers, and it's pretty cool.
It is pretty cool. And the idea that teachers represent just ordinary people, right? There is something that feels very wholesome about it. And that kind of cuts against the image of astronauts as these like highly trained scientists and predominantly men. So it really is this, I don't know, it's this kind of special moment. And it's this kind of national participation, which I think was of a piece with how the Reagan administration imagined itself operating in the United States. Coming out of the 1970s, we're going to get ordinary Americans involved in all of these patriotic ventures, from Hands Across America, which we've talked about before, to something like this, where everybody has a stake in it because it's people from your state and you can cheer them on. And that, I think, is of a piece with what Reagan was hoping to do to boost the morale of the country.
It is worth pointing out that there was a little skepticism about this program, both from people who said, you know, this is a couple months before an election, that's interesting timing, but also, you know, the president of the National Education Association basically said, how about instead of sending just one of us to space, you support all of us through, you know, better education funding, which had been cut under Reagan, and backing teachers unions. And we've talked about Reagan's relationship with unions and so forth. So, you know, maybe a little political spinning there as well. But, you know, it is worth.
I can't be mad at that. Like
no.
the critique is legit. I mean, if you think about the fact that, like, what is required to get all schools equipped with the supplies, with the technology that they would need to, you know, take their students to the next level. This is the same critique that came out in 1969 when we're, you know, sending a man to the moon, and the black community is like, really? How about you solve poverty? Like, how about you deal with crime?
And it's happening now, right? It's like, well, all these billionaires are concerned with sending them and their friends into space when they could, you know, think about more holistic solutions here at home. Yes, absolutely. Let's get into the actual details of the program. NIki, why don't you tell us a little bit about Christa McAuliffe? And I suppose another really fascinating character here, too, is a woman by the name of Barbara Morgan. So what do we need to know about these two teachers?
Yeah, so Christa McAuliffe is a social studies teacher from Concord High School in Concord, New Hampshire. And she had been one of those people who Kellie was talking about who was inspired by watching the moon landing. She said in her application, "I watched the space age being born and I would like to participate." And the runner-up or the backup for her was Barbara Morgan, who was a teacher from Idaho. So you have these two women who go into training to become astronauts. They go through this intensive program through NASA in order to train themselves up. And they become, particularly Christa McAuliffe, kind of these national figures, right? Kind of mini celebrities, because they represent something achievable to ordinary Americans. And so Christa McAuliffe is going to go up in the space shuttle and she's going to teach a class from space, all of which has this very wholesome feel to it. And Barbara Morgan is one of her biggest cheerleaders. There's footage from the day of the launch where she is standing there cheering as the rocket goes up, waving goodbye, so excited to see this dream of a teacher in space fulfilled.
As all of this mission is getting ready to take place, this will be the 25th space shuttle mission, 24 of which had been completed successfully. So I think that, first of all, there is no reason for people to suspect that something tragic might happen. But this is also something that, like, I don't know how many kids across the country watched in their schools, had the TVs wheeled into their classroom to watch this epic launch of the first teacher into space, and also the first African American as well. You know, Ronald McNair is on this, on the Challenger as well. So there are a lot of firsts that are taking place that make this such a historic moment,
and a national one, right? It's one of those moments, and these are still relatively rare by the 1980s. This idea that we're all participating in one national media moment. It's something that we had with the moon landing. It's something that happened after John Kennedy was assassinated. But this idea that everyone's tuned into the same thing at the same time. And as you were saying, Kellie, like, television's being wheeled into classrooms in a time when televisions were not something that you had in classrooms. No. But this was such a big deal that there were just lots and lots and lots of people watching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as we've sort of been saying, but on a number of fronts, the Challenger was being specifically positioned, I think, as a kind of like notable American unified moment.
It was diverse.
So, you know,
I mean, it was the first time NASA is doing like diversity, equity, and inclusion in their space program. You know, like, they wanted it to be something that people could look at and see themselves and say, as a Black child, I can do this. As a woman, I can do this. As an Asian American, I can do this. You know, to see that I think is what is one of the most powerful things about NASA, is that they really have tried to get beyond the white male prototype in terms of who can be an astronaut. That's why Mae Jemison is such a big deal. You know, she comes later along, but like, to see a Black woman astronaut was a big deal.
There's a critical space theory joke in here somewhere, but I don't know exactly how to get to it.
Boo.
But yes, boo, yes. Sorry. You were making a very serious point. I apologize.
No, it's you know, it's a special moment. We'll say
that. For sure.
Well, and it was also like part of a generational shift, not just because of the people who were included, but NASA had big plans to send a journalist into space, right? To send all types of ordinary citizens into space moving forward. So there was a lot riding on this.
And, you know, this explosion, the Challenger explosion, perhaps not surprisingly, you know, really does like take the wind out of all of those initiatives.
Yeah.
You know, Reagan, I think, in his remarks says we will send more to space, we will send more teachers to space. But fairly quickly, the teacher in space program, by 1990, it is done. And there is never, you know, there isn't another person as part of this specific initiative who was sent into there. And the idea of sending private citizens into space, as we've seen, you know, it sort of takes a back seat for a while. That said, Barbara Morgan, the other name we've talked about. So Christa McAuliffe dies in the Challenger explosion. Barbara Morgan, the other person involved here, who was the backup, ends up having a very sort of interesting coda to this and actually stays involved in space travel in a really kind of fascinating way, especially since I think you mentioned this, Nikki, but she's actually watching at that moment. There's video footage of her watching the explosion. You can only imagine what's going through her mind as the backup for that moment, but she nevertheless stays as an astronaut.
Yeah, she stops being a teacher. She joins NASA. Once the Teachers in Space program was shut down, she stays on, and she's actually supposed to be on a flight of the Columbia. But 9 months before her scheduled launch into space, the Columbia explodes on re-entry. And so once again, her opportunity to go into space has been thwarted by another major crisis. And she ultimately, though, does get to go into space when the International Space Station is launched, and she's able to go up and be in the space station. I think she's there for 13 days, which is a pretty lengthy time to be in space. And so she finally has that dream fulfilled. It must have been 23 years after this initial
I'm shocked she still wanted to do it, to be honest. I mean, I can't imagine seeing those tragedies and feeling like, put me in, coach. I feel like I probably would have walked away. But I mean, I think that also shows the tenacity and the spirit and the dedication that people had, the commitment that people had to the space program, was that that all of the progress, even the setbacks, were in some way worth it in order to continue this mission.
Yeah. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the episode. Before we go, I want to shout out two little also on this days, and actually ones that we've done on this show before, but it's a reminder that, we're in the depths of August here. Traditionally, not much news or silly things get turned into news. And as an example of that, and we certainly covered them last year on this show, but the day before this day was the day in 2014 that Obama wore his tan suit, and that became a whole thing.
Another major national crisis.
Yep, and we did an episode on that last year. And then the day after today, August 30th, in 1979, was the day that Jimmy Carter, or the story broke about Jimmy Carter's showdown with a deranged rabbit. And we did 2 episodes on that last year. That silly season in August, but those were very fun episodes. I think Sam Sanders was our guest for those. Yeah. But yeah, there you go. Those are the other sort of those are the kinds of stories that pop up in mid-August.
Also New Year's Day.
Now, exactly. Okay, well, that's the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Krista McCullough, a Harvard, New Hampshire high school social studies teacher, will be the one to actually fly in space early next year.
It's not often that a teacher is at a loss for words. I know my students wouldn't think so. I've made 9 wonderful friends over the last 2 weeks. And when that shuttle goes, they might be one body. But there's going to be 10 souls that I'm taking with me. Thank you.
Radiotopia.